lonely cowboy, came to buy a horse. But fate led him to a widow with 5 kids and 1 empty chair. Before we ride into this story, take a moment to drop a comment below. Let us know where you're watching from, what town or city you're calling home tonight. And when the end this story, don't forget to rate this story from 0 Sosiu Dachin. Tuwing 6 Kukla, Jacho Snorer. Now lean back, get comfortable, and enjoy the story. She clutched a corn husk doll to her chest and whispered to it, "He has Papa's eyes." The man she spoke of, a stranger with blood on his name, who'd come to their ranch with nothing but a gold pouch, a hidden past, and every intention of leaving before the rain stopped. But some storms don't pass. Some storms change everything. The wind came in steady off the Sweetwater Ridge that afternoon in autumn of 1847, tugging dry leaves across the porch of a ranch that looked proud even in its exhaustion. Tom Garrett rode alone, as he always had, 32 years old and dust-worn from the saddle, with a leather pouch full of honest gold, and a silence that had kept him alive in towns that would have strung him up if they knew who he once rode with. He wasn't there to start trouble, just to buy a horse, one good mount, to carry him through the next chapter, wherever that might be. But when he crested the ridge and looked down into that valley, he saw fences leaning like tired men, a barn door hanging like a broken jaw, and no ranch hands anywhere, just smoke curling from a chimney, as if hope itself was still trying to stand its ground. He expected a rancher, maybe a man with sunburnt arms and a shotgun. What he got was a woman, Eleanor Sullivan, red hair tied back in a no-nonsense knot, green eyes like cut glass. She didn't flinch when she saw him, didn't apologize for the dust on her dress, or the way her hands smelled of bread flour and soap. She looked him dead in the eye and said, "You'll be here about the horses." It wasn't a question. Tom tipped his hat out of habit, not chivalry. Thomas Garrett. He said, "Saw your ad in the Cheyenne newspaper. Said you had quality stock." Behind her, the screen door creaked, and little faces ducked out of sight. He caught a blur of freckles, a flash of red hair, and the unmistakable hush of children, too trained to speak when strangers came calling. At least 4 of them, he guessed. Maybe more? Eleanor's voice was steady, but Tom could hear what she wasn't saying. Her husband gone. Her hands full, her land fighting back harder than she could push. And yet, she stood tall. "These horses weren't raised for men who use spurs and whips," she said, leading him toward the pasture. "My husband believed in partnership between horse and rider." They passed a vegetable garden still growing despite the frost, and a porch rail patched in 5 different kinds of wood. Everything here bore the fingerprints of survival, not perfection, perseverance. In the field, Tom saw them, 20 head of the finest stock he'd seen this side of the Rockies. Glossy coats, clean eyes, no bite or fear, just good animals raised with care. He studied the mare named Copper, the black gelding called Thunder, horses that could carry a man across rivers, plains into battle or home again. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said, voice lower now. "These animals are worth a fortune." Her shoulders dipped just enough to show her weariness. Value don't mean much if no one's willing to pay it. And then it slipped out Tom's question, uninvited and unplanned. "How many children you raising here, ma'am?" Her eyes narrowed. 6. Ages 6 to 16. "Why do you ask?" Before he could answer, a tall boy stepped from the barn with a rifle in hand. Not pointed, but present. That was Patrick, the oldest, the man of the house by necessity, not by choice. Serious eyes, dirt on his sleeves, voice not quite settled. "Everything all right?" "Meh." "It is now," she said, calm as morning. One by one, they appeared. Michael, with ink-stained fingers. Bridget, red-haired like her mama. Sean, bouncing like a coyote pup. Then the youngest Molly, small, quiet, corn-husk doll clutched to her chest. She said nothing. Just watched Tom with eyes that studied his soul without asking permission. And just like that, Tom felt the walls he'd built across years of drift and solitude begin to shift. The wind picked up, the sky darkened, thunder rolled low. Not the kind that warned it promised. "You're welcome to wait out the storm in the barn," Eleanor offered. Polite but not warm, Tom glanced at the children. Patrick, still standing like a sentinel. Molly, half hidden behind her mother's skirt. And that house behind them, simple, sturdy, glowing faintly, with a yellow light that made his chest ache with something he hadn't felt in years. "Actually," he said, adjusting the brim of his hat, "I'd like to discuss terms. Might be I'm looking to buy more than just one horse." She didn't answer right away, just studied him. Quiet as snowfall, measured the stranger on her land against whatever instinct told her he wasn't like the others. And then she turned toward the house. Would she dare to let him stay? Part 1. A stranger at supper. The moment Tom Garrett stepped through the doorway, the room fell quiet. Not out of fear, but in a hush that felt like the air itself was holding its breath. It was the kind of silence that waits, that listens, like something important was about to begin. Tom didn't say a word, just took off his hat, brushed the rain from his shoulders, and followed Eleanor's small nod toward the long wooden table. It stood worn, but well-tended, at the center of the room, like everything else in that house, shaped by hands that had worked too hard to ever give up. 6 places were already set. Now, a 7th had been added, a plain bowl and spoon placed across from the children. Tom sat down slowly, boots still wet with the road, leaving faint traces of mud on the floorboards. And though part of him tensed at the warmth around him after so many years of being met with suspicion, it didn't stop the children from looking. Patrick, the oldest, sat stiff-backed and watchful, arms folded like he was the man of the house and meant to prove it. Michael peeked up now and again from under his lashes, ink-stained fingers twitching like he missed his paper. Bridget moved calmly, ladling stew into bowls as if this night were no different than 100 before it. Sean shifted and fidgeted, a spark of mischief never far from his fingers. And Molly, quiet little Molly, held tight to her corn-husk doll like it was a secret. Only she understood. Tom didn't ask them anything. He didn't offer anything either. But the stew was warm, the bread fresh, and when the lantern light spilled across the table, it lit Eleanor's auburn hair with the soft glow of old whiskey kissed by fire. She barely sat down too much to tend, too many small needs to meet. But when she spoke, it was only to remind a child to sit straighter or to hush the clatter of a spoon. It should have been just a supper, like any other. But for Tom Garrett, it felt like a memory he hadn't made yet. Later, when the storm pressed harder against the windows and thunder growled low in the distance, he stood at the barn's threshold, saddlebags in hand. He hadn't said goodbye, just shifted his weight, like he meant to vanish into the night. Same as always, you heading out. Eleanor's voice came quiet, catching him just before he stepped away. He turned to find her there, sleeves rolled, dress hem damp, no smile on her face, just a question in her eyes, one she was too proud to ask. "I don't want to overstay," he said. "You haven't," she replied. Then, after a breath, "But I don't let strangers stay under my roof." The rain answered for them steady, relentless. Thunder rolled, deep and distant, like a memory with teeth. Then came the softest sound. Molly had wandered in barefoot, doll held close to her chest. She stood beside her mother, quiet as snowfall, and looked up at Tom, not like he was danger, not like he was dirt, but like he was something softer. "She says you've got Papa's eyes," Molly whispered, eyes wide and clear. Tom didn't know what struck deeper, her voice, The word Papa, or the steady truth behind it. He crouched slow, stiff from too many years and too many miles, and gently touched the edge of the doll's skirt. "She's wise," he said, voice just barely holding. "She helps us remember good things still happen," Molly added. Then, without waiting for reply, she turned and walked back toward the fire. Like that, truth didn't need any more proving. Tom stayed. He didn't know why. He didn't question it. He unrolled his bedroll in the hay, laid back beneath the flickering lantern light, and pulled something small from his coat. A compass, brass, tarnished by time. He clicked it open and turned the back lid. Inside, a photograph, faded, worn, a young couple, arm in arm, his parents, the last people who'd ever looked at him like he mattered. He stared at it for a long time, the compass steady in his hand, as the storm roared and wept all around the barn. Tom hadn't come here to belong, but something had shifted, and suddenly, the road ahead didn't feel so lonely anymore. Part 2. When the rain took him. By morning, the storm hadn't eased. It hung low over the valley, like a warning no one dared speak aloud, soaking into the soil, into the bones of the land. But inside the Sullivan Ranch, life stirred anyway. A fire popped in the cast-iron stove. Boots creaked across worn floorboards, and laughter faint, fleeting, rose into the air like steam off fresh coffee. Tom had stayed the night in the barn, yes, but something had changed. Sometime after midnight, Molly had tiptoed in and laid a quilt over his legs, a small thing, stitched uneven by little hands, but warmer than any blanket he could remember. Come sunrise, Michael had left a pencil beside Tom's saddlebags, in case you want to write things down. He'd said, without meeting his eyes. Eleanor didn't say a word, but when she handed him a cup of chicory coffee, her fingers lingered just a breath too long around his. Tom said nothing. He didn't know how to name what was shifting between them. Later, he helped mend the north fence. Patrick worked at his side, still guarded, but quieter. The two didn't speak much. Didn't need to. Fences don't require conversation, just rhythm and rope and trust hard-earned through silence. It was the beginning of something, small, fragile, and fragile things. They break easy. Just before supper, the sound came sharp through the rain hooves, fast, heavy, cutting through the storm like a blade. 3 riders. Tom saw them from the barn, black shapes cresting the rise. He knew the kind of men they were before the badges caught the light, knew that walk, that weight, that intent. One dismounted, spurs jangling, rain dripping off the brim of his hat, eyes hard and sure, looking for a man named Thomas Garrett. The sheriff said, voice flat. The world went quiet. Even the storm seemed to hush. Eleanor stepped onto the porch, arms crossed tight across her chest. What's he done? The sheriff unfolded a paper, already damp at the edges. Wanted out of Denver. Robbery. Names listed with Jake Toiver's gang. Patrick was beside his mother now. Molly peeked out from behind her skirt, hugging her doll, hope so tight it looked like it might come apart. Tom didn't flinch, didn't run, didn't argue. He stepped forward. That'd be me. The sheriff gave a single nod. You'll come with us. Eleanor's voice cracked like firewood. He's been here all week, fixing fences, teaching my children. Her hands trembled, but her voice held steady. Got a witness. The sheriff said, claims Garrett was at the bank job last month. $3,000 stolen. Michael dropped his notebook. Bridget gasped. Sean pressed into his mother's side. Patrick just stared, like someone had turned the world upside down and hadn't bothered to warn him. Tom said nothing. Didn't beg. Didn't explain. But he looked at Eleanor, and for the first time in his life, someone looked back at him, not with doubt, but with belief. I'll go, he said quietly. It'll get sorted. No, Eleanor murmured. Voice, barely more than breath. Not the way things get sorted out here. The cuffs were cold. The rain, colder, as the metal clicked shut around his wrists. Tom turned back one last time. The 6 children stood in a row, their faces lit not with fear, but something closer to disbelief, something closer to heartbreak. Then Molly stepped forward. She didn't cry, didn't shout. She simply said, "Bad men don't read stories to little girls." And that was the thing that broke him. It broke Eleanor, too, and Patrick, and every unspoken promise in that yard. As the riders turned to leave, Eleanor called after him, not a plea, not a goodbye, a vow. "This isn't over, Thomas Garrett," she said. Not by a long shot. Part 3. The Courtroom and the Cornhusk Doll. They rode into Cheyenne like a storm with a name. 2 wagons, 6 children, and 1 widow who hadn't closed her eyes in 3 days. Eleanor wore her black Sunday dress, the one kept for church and farewells, and her jaw was set like stone carved by prairie wind. Patrick gripped the reins with hands steadier than most grown men. Michael clutched his notebook like scripture. Sean leaned out the back to count the buildings. And Molly sat pressed against Eleanor's side, her cornhusk doll. Hope clutched to her chest like a prayer someone forgot to answer. Somewhere inside the courthouse, Tom Garrett sat alone in a cell, his past hanging on his name like tar. Eleanor hadn't seen him since the arrest, but she felt him. In the chair that stayed empty at supper, in the creak of the barn door no one had gotten around to fixing, in every quiet space where a voice should have been. The courtroom was packed. News had spread like fire over dry grass. A wanted man, a drifter, a name, tied to Jake Toiver's gang, and a widow with 6 children who called him family. Judge Hawthorne sat high at the bench, eyebrows like thunderclouds, gavel in hand, ready to strike. Then the door swung wide, and Eleanor Sullivan walked in. Behind her, the children followed still, solemn. Brave in the way only those who've lost before can be. Whispers stirred, heads turned, but Eleanor didn't break stride. "Your Honor," she said, her Irish lilt crisp as frost. "I need to speak on behalf of Thomas Garrett." The prosecutor was on his feet in a blink. "This is highly irregular. She has no legal standing. She has a voice," the judge said flatly. "Let her use it." Eleanor stepped into the center of the courtroom. She held no papers. She read from nothing, and she did not tremble. 7 days ago, a man came to buy a horse. He could have left. Most would have, but he stayed. He mended fences in the rain. He taught my children. He told bedtime stories when my little girl cried. Michael rose from the pew, voice soft but clear. "I wrote it all down," he said, lifting his notebook. Every hour he worked, every good thing he did. He opened it. Monday, fixed the barn door, bought nails with his own money. Tuesday, helped Patrick gentle the new colt. Wednesday, rode to town for medicine when Sean had fever. Bridget stood next, hair catching the morning light. He told me smart girls grow up strong. Then Sean, he said, "I draw like an artist." And finally, Molly. She walked slowly, small steps across the courtroom floor, still holding Hope tight in both arms. He said, "The princess didn't need saving," she whispered, "because she was brave enough to save herself." Tom watched from where he sat in chains, unmoving, but his eyes never left Molly. The judge leaned forward. "Mr. Prosecutor, do you have proof he was in Denver?" "One witness," the man snapped. "Claims he saw Garrett the night of the robbery." "One?" the judge echoed. "Against a family who lived with him." Then the back doors opened again, and chains rattled. Jake Toiver entered flanked by you. So, marshals, older, harder, meaner, but not untouchable. His gaze scanned the room, landing last on the girl by the pew, the one holding the doll. Something in his face shifted. The judge didn't wait. Do you have something to say? Mr. Toiver. Jake stepped forward. Every person in that courtroom leaned in. Thomas Garrett never robbed that bank, Jake said. Gasps rippled. Even the judge paused. Jake went on, voice rough but clear. He left my crew 5 years back, called me a coward, rode off after we robbed a house with kids that looked like them. He nodded toward the Sullivan children. Tom's too damn honest to steal, Jake said. Always was. Silence. Then the gavel struck. In light of this testimony, the judge declared, I'm dropping all charges. The room broke like spring ice. Patrick whooped. Michael clutched his notebook. Molly ran forward and grabbed Tom's hand without asking, like she'd been holding a space for it all along. But Tom wasn't smiling. Not fully. Not yet. Because even freedom has a cost, and some debts still needed paying. Part 4. The Firefight and the Promise. Tom Garrett always thought freedom would feel like a sunrise slow, golden, patient, something that crept in gentle and sure. Instead, it came with gunfire. He'd barely finished his second bowl of Eleanor's stew, barely heard Molly whisper, welcome home with the kind of softness that made men believe in tomorrow again. And then the past thundered down Main Street, guns drawn, voices shouting. Jake Toiver's old gang hadn't come for mercy. They came to a race. Bullets tore through the quiet morning like thunder-splitting sky. People screamed, horses reared, and Tom's instincts, built from years of surviving, screamed run. But something deeper held him still. Molly's whisper, Sean's laugh, Patrick's quiet hand on his shoulder the night before, saying, I'm glad you stayed. And Eleanor, he dove, pulled Patrick down with him. Just as the hotel's porch rail exploded into splinters, the boy's heart was pounding fast, but his eyes stayed clear. You know how to shoot? Tom asked, low and tight. Patrick nodded once. No flair, no fear, just the quiet resolve of a boy who'd already had to grow too fast. Tom slid a Winchester toward him. The sheriff's gun, grabbed from the desk as they ducked for cover. Then let's protect what's ours. The fight didn't last long, but it felt like it had no end. 3 men, guns wild with desperation. Jake's boys, cornered by truth, trying to bury it under noise and blood. But they hadn't counted on a town that had stopped being afraid. They hadn't counted on a man who no longer ran from what he cared for. When it was over, 2 outlaws lay still in the street. One was caught breathing and bound. Tom had a bullet in his shoulder, but he could still stand, still walk, still see. And what he saw was Eleanor, running across the dust-stained road, her eyes wide, her hands trembling as they reached for him. You could have died, she breathed, voice breaking like wind over glass. But I didn't, Tom said, then quieter. And now, I know what I have to do. The marshals found a map folded tight in one of the outlaws' pockets. Ink-stained trails, marked trees, landmarks that whispered of buried coin, not just from one robbery, but many. Families had been left empty, homes burned to shadow. And now Tom, he knew where it was buried. That night, in the hush, after the fire was banked, and the children were finally asleep, Eleanor sat beside him, hands folded, voice low. You don't have to go, she said. I do, he answered. Not because I'm running, but because I want to make it right. She nodded once, a woman who understood when a man had chosen his road. The next morning, he packed light. Patrick helped saddle the horses, his hands more sure than ever. Michael drew a new map by lamplight, folded it neatly and said, I'll write you every week. Bridget slipped jerky into his bag. Mama says to chew slow. Sean gave him a rock for luck. Works better than it looks. And Molly didn't say anything. She just placed Hope, her corn husk doll, into his saddlebag when he wasn't looking. When Tom noticed, she nodded solemnly, like a preacher giving a benediction. "Come back when you're done," she said, "not before." And so he rode, not as a drifter, not anymore, as a man with a purpose. Weeks passed, then months. He found one stash beneath a pine tree with a cross carved into its bark, another buried behind a dry waterfall Jake once laughed about over whiskey, the last hidden in a rusted kettle at the bottom of Red Hollow Canyon, came with a note, Jake's handwriting, mocking the world. Tom turned it all in. He signed statements, gave testimony, told the truth for folks who'd never had the chance to say their piece, returned stolen money to hands that had forgotten the weight of hope. And when he came back, 6 months later, snow dusted the hills above Sweetwater like powdered sugar on bread. Eleanor stood on the porch, hands white with flour. Patrick leaned on the barn rail, taller now. Michael held his notebook like it was scripture. And Molly ran barefoot into the yard, a new doll swinging from one hand, Hope's twin, stitched with red thread and a button eye. She didn't ask if he was staying. She didn't need to. She just opened her arms. Part 5. The Compass and the Name. 6 months later, snow came softly to Sweetwater Valley. Not the cruel kind that cuts through coats and skin, but the quiet kind. The kind that settles like a prayer, draping over rooftops and fence rails as if the land itself had finally remembered how to be gentle. Inside the Sullivan Ranch house, it smelled of rising bread and saddle soap. A fire crackled in the hearth, steady as a heartbeat. And out on the porch, Eleanor. Now, Eleanor Garrett wrapped her shawl tighter and stepped into the stillness, just in time to see Patrick and Michael down by the creek. Stringing wire between new fence posts, Tom stood beside her, one hand resting on the porch rail, the other tucked deep into his coat. He didn't say much, never had, but his arm brushed hers, just enough to say everything that didn't need words. "You ever think we'd end up here?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small, brass, worn, smooth by time and memory. The old compass. He hadn't looked at it once since he came home. Flicking it open, he let it settle in his palm. The needle twitched once, then stilled. "Patrick asked me why I kept this," Tom said. "Told me. I already knew where I was going now." He turned it over and opened the back panel, hidden from sight, but worn at the edges from years of handling. Inside was a photograph, faded with time. 2 people, young and bright-eyed, his parents, frozen in a moment the world had tried, but failed, to steal from him. "I carried them with me all these years," he said softly. "Hoped one day I'd find a place they'd be proud to see me settle." Eleanor didn't speak. She just looked out across the land. Fences, mended, horses, well-fed, laughter from the barn, where life had returned in fits and starts, the way it always does when good people stay. "You think this is it?" she asked quietly. Tom didn't answer at first. He glanced through the window, where Bridget was helping Sean trace letters on paper. Molly sat cross-legged on the floor nearby, 2 dolls in her lap, telling a story in soft whispers about a cowboy who returned the treasure. Instead, Tom breathed deep. "I know it is." The ranch had changed in the time he was gone. The $15 0-0 reward had helped, but not half as much as Michael's idea. The boy had kept everything, every note, every hour, every detail. And with help from the Cheyenne newspaper, he'd published a small pamphlet titled "The Man Who Brought the Money Back," and the world answered. First a trickle, then a flood. Letters from widows, from shopkeepers, from men who'd lost faith, and women who thought no one remembered. Some sent coins, others simple words of thanks. A few asked to send their sons to learn horses the Sweetwater way. So that's what they built. Not just a ranch, but a place to begin again. Tom taught young men to ride and mend and work with their hands. Eleanor taught women to manage money, run books, and build what had been broken. Patrick led the horses. Bridget became the first to teach letters inside the old barn. Now, a schoolroom with windows full of light. Michael kept writing, but it was Molly who said the thing that stayed. One evening by lantern light, she sat at the table, sketching circles, 3 of them. One was a compass. One was open with a photo tucked inside. The third had her name drawn beneath it in the smallest handwriting she could manage. I think home, she said, is when your name belongs somewhere. Tom looked at that drawing for a long, long time. Later that night, when the house had gone quiet and snow whispered across the porch roof, he picked up the old compass again, and with the edge of his knife, he carved a single letter into the back lid. Not for Garrett, not for gold, but for given, as in this life, this second chance, this family. It hadn't been earned. So it had been given because once a lonely cowboy came to buy a horse and stayed. The man who stayed. Tom Garrett had spent most of his life chasing horizons. Some men run because they're guilty, others because they're lonely, and a few because deep down they don't believe they deserve to be found. But when Tom stepped onto that ranch in Sweetwater Valley, everything shifted. Not because someone came to fix him, not because he earned forgiveness, but because a woman and 6 children looked at him and saw the man he could be. They didn't ask what he'd done. They asked if he was hungry. They didn't stare at his scars. They asked if he'd stay for supper. That's the thing about families like the Sullivans. They don't wait for you to prove yourself. They just pass you a second bowl of stew and quietly hope you'll come back tomorrow. What did this story stir in you? Tell us in the comments and rate it from 0 to 10. If this kind of tale sits close to your heart, if you've ever chosen staying over running, if you've ever believed in someone before they believed in themselves, go ahead and comment. I understand, Tom, because the greatest stories out west, they're not about gunfights or gold. They're about love without guarantees, about choosing to build something steady in a world that keeps telling you to keep riding on. And if this one touched something quiet in you, just wait for the next See You by the Fire partner. Until then, keep your compass pointed toward kindness. That's how you'll always find your way back.